Good. I think we need a rapid summary of events after the era of Lorenzo the Great, Lorenzo il Magnifico, and you have therefore a handout which is a summary of all those events that I'm going to rush through now in a sort of selected way, so that we can bridge the gap between the old family, so to speak, the principal branch of the family, and the cadet branch, which begins its career with the second Duke. To clarify right at the beginning, the first two guys who were in charge, so to speak, were Duke of Florence, a papal title, okay, and the second Duke of Florence became Cosimo I, Duke of Tuscany, and he was the later Cosimo, Grand Duke of Tuscany. Cosimo I, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and from then on, from 1564 to the end of their dynasty in 1743, they were Grand Dukes. In the first case, a papal title, and in the second case, a title from the empire, from the emperor. This is the coat of arms, the stemma, as it's called in Italian, of the Grand Duke at the height of the power of the Grand Dukes. To explain it a little, you see, first of all, a corona, which implies that it's a royal Grand Duke, the front of which has a Giulio, the lily of Florence, not to be confused with the fleur-de-lis, which you see underneath it, in fact, on the blue ball. That is the fleur-de-lis, given by the French kings as a kind of homage to the Medici to use on their coat of arms. Then the other 5 balls, which were traditional. The number of balls differed at different ages, but finally settled on 6 like that. And behind the central oval piece, you see 3 wings of the Cross of St. Stephen, the order established by the Grand Dukes of Tuscany. Everybody who's a Grand Duke of a whole country or whatever must establish an order, it seems. Carefully looking at the frame scroll of the oval with the balls in, you can see the feathers again, a kind of hangover from the earlier Medici family. And surrounding the whole thing very proudly with the fleece, the Order of the Golden Fleece, the most prestigious order of Europe, an order established, I think, by the Holy Roman Emperor. We'll have a moment, we'll see it in a moment again later. So that is something that appears time and time again all over Florence, as you can imagine. At Lorenzo's death, his place at the helm of power in Florence was taken by his son Piero. Not usually Pietro, which it says on your family tree, on the handout of first lecture, not usually Pietro at all, but Piero. And this is his portrait. Again, on this portrait, which I've cut the bottom off, it says Pietro. So if you see this elsewhere, maybe the complete thing is on my website, and it says Pietro underneath. Don't be misled. He was 21 at the time, and he was probably not cut out for his job. Was it perhaps that his father had been such a charismatic, imposing presence that Piero had always stood only in his shadow and not beside him? Perhaps his education had been more remote from everyday affairs than his father's had been. His father, remember, was really always involved in civic affairs from a very young age. And I mean young, sort of 12 or 13, he was already sent on diplomatic missions, Lorenzo il Magnifico, whereas because he was such a humanist and so interested in philosophy relating to the classical period, to Platonism and all that, that's how he brought up his sons, rather than in the visual arts and architecture, as we've seen his great interest was. Anyway, so he was probably more remote from everyday affairs than his father, and less suited then to a position of power. The portrait, by the way, is by Bronzino, so it's a later portrait, and Bronzino, as we'll see, painted innumerable, uncountable Medici, dead or alive. In addition to his probably unsuitable personality, Piero was facing the rise of the rabble, bestirred by the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola. Interesting portraits here, both by Fra Bartolomeo. Savonarola's characteristic profile on the left, and on the right, depicted in his Dominican robes as St. Peter Martyr. St. Peter Martyr, one of the triumvirate or the trinity of the Dominican order, who was murdered on his way from Florence to Bologna, and famously, with the blood that was coming out of his head, wrote with his finger in the sand, "Credo, I believe," and then he expired. So just as well he believed. Savonarola was famous for the bonfire of the vanities and his stirring sermons against profanity and the abuses in the church, marvelously depicted here in the 19th century style of narrative historical painting that looks more like an Istanbul bazaar, I think, than Florence Cathedral. And do you see how down here in the left-hand corner they're piling up their treasures to burn? He had an extraordinary, of course, charisma and power, in a sense. In September 1494, Charles VIII of France, also an interesting little portrait, but we can't talk about it. Look at his order that he's wearing around his neck. I think it's the Order of St. Michael. However, he was passing through Florence. He invaded Italy and threatened, not very convincingly, threatened Florence. Savonarola's prophecies of doom for this city that was covered in vanities and profanities seemed to be coming to a verge of fulfillment. And Piero de' Medici ceded some Florentine territory, Pisa, Sarzana, and Livorno, all three important parts of the Florentine territory. He ceded them to Charles, thinking that this was the way of saving Florence from the French invasion, which probably wouldn't have happened. Charles was intent on heading for Naples to reclaim the Bourbon throne of Naples, and he probably didn't think very much about invading Florence, using up his army, using up his military power there, when a greater reward was further south. But clearly, Piero played his cards incorrectly, giving up territory in order to save the city. Well, of course it backfired, because it was the wrong thing to do. Instead of the citizens of Florence being grateful that he had saved them, they were enraged. So much so that they kicked him out. They expelled him, and all the Medici. So Piero himself joined the French troops. I guess that he thought if he went south with them on the way back, he would reclaim Florence. Unfortunately, he drowned in a river while he was in the southern part of Italy with the French army. So the Medici seem to have run out of leaders. That was Lorenzo's son. Lorenzo's other two sons were both in the church, and it seemed they too were exiled, of course, in the Republican period, in the Savonarola period, and the Medici seem to have run out of leaders in Florence and around Florence itself. There were, of course, many Medici of the other side of the family in the woodwork. Savonarola intervened with the French king, and his dealing with the French king couldn't have been really that difficult because, as I say, the French king's attitude was not so aggressive towards Florence. But because he dealt with the French king, the rabble of the Florentine citizenry, who already, in a sense, had been incantata, what can I say, enchanted by this man, let him establish a new constitution for Florence. A popular republic was established, declaring that Florence would be the new Jerusalem, the world center of Christianity, and, I quote, richer, more powerful, more glorious than ever. Savonarola instituted the campaign of extreme austerity, enlisting the active help of the Florentine youth to patrol streets, to curb immodest dress and behavior. Very familiar pattern of behavior of tyrants. The youth brigade, so to speak. In April 1495, he declared Jesus Christ to be King of Florence. That made a situation in Florence rather paradoxical, I must say. Florence is now a republic with a new constitution, but an absentee king, Jesus. Absentee, at least physically, shall we say. Effectively ruled by a fanatic monk who, as a non-citizen, because he was Ferrarese, he came from Ferrara, as a non-citizen and as a cleric, he was ineligible to hold office. So we have a kind of Savonarola who had the power that the Medicis had had, also without office. Their faction, the Savonarola faction, took shape and steered his program through the councils. The oligarchs who had been most compromised by their service to the Medici were barred from office. The new constitution enfranchised the artisan class. It opened minor civic offices to selection by lot, and it granted every citizen in good standing the right to vote in a new parliament called the Consiglio Maggiore, or Great Council. Well, as we know, Savonarola's comeuppance came pretty soon. In 1495, when Florence obviously refused to join the Pope's Holy League against the French, Savonarola, remember, had just made an agreement with the French king. The Holy League, to which he should have belonged, formed by the Pope, was now fighting the French king. You remember that I said yesterday how the papal connection with the throne of Naples was in an agreement that Naples would come to the military help of the papal states. So now the papal states call on Florence to be part of the League, the Holy League, and Florence, of course, Savonarola, first of all, is violently against the abuses in the church and not very popular with the Pope, and he's against making an enemy of the French that he's come to an agreement with and who will be passing this way on their way home. So, Pope Alexander VI summoned Savonarola to Rome to sort things out. Pope Alexander VI, interesting man in himself, one of the Borgias. Savonarola disobeyed. He didn't go to Rome. He said, I'm not coming to Rome. Rome's corrupt. The church is corrupt. And he further defied the Pope by preaching under a ban. The Pope banned him, but he continued to preach. And he continued to highlight his campaign against church reform. He had processions, the bonfires, and pious theatricals. In retaliation, the Pope excommunicated him in May 1497 and threatened to place Florence under an interdict. The long and the short of it is that on May the 23rd, a year later, 1498, the church and the civil authorities condemned, hanged, and burned Savonarola and two of his mates in the main square of Florence. This is a contemporary drawing. It's like a photographer. Lacking a photographer, they had people who did this. And it's such a fascinating little picture. It's in San Marco, because it's like it's a continuous narrative painting, inasmuch as you see the three victims, so to speak. You see, first of all, the three here being led out of the Palazzo Vecchio. You recognize the Palazzo Vecchio. Look, there's Donatello's Judith and Holofernes. Very appropriate for them to pass under there. And there they say their last prayers at an outdoor altar. Then they are hooded. They're not hooded. These are the hooded Misericordia people. All three of them are hanged. Zap, hang three together, and then burn them. And the populace, and including the priests from San Marco, are all agog. This picture, there presumably they are redeemed and go to heaven. Looks like somebody waiting for them up there in a cloud. This picture, interestingly enough, on a completely different level, is practically the only eyewitness painting of this time and of this place. And there was great debate in Florence about 20 years ago when this piazza was dug up for archaeological purposes as to whether it should be repaved in this way. This is an extraordinary phenomenon because it's paved with cotto, which is only used in the best houses nowadays in Florence. Florence was extraordinarily rich and could make its public squares with cotto. In some towns in Italy still, around about Carrara, you find that all the pavements are Carrara marble, and the squares are Carrara marble, just like it's old common bricks. Anyway, that's beside the point. Savonarola's devotees continued, nevertheless, to keep his republican cause of freedom and religious reform alive well into the next century. 4 centuries later, a plaque was laid to mark the place of his martyrdom on Piazza Signoria of Florence. And each year on the anniversary of the event appear flowers or wreaths. There is even, in fact, a movement to have him beatified. With the end of Savonarola, the moderate Medici supporters returned to the government, led by one Piero Soderini, under the old title of Gonfaloniere. And he managed more or less a reconciliation of all the parties. And 1502, he was actually made Gonfaloniere for life. However, he was not a very strong leader. The Soderini government, in which Machiavelli, by the way, played an important part as secretary, was mainly occupied with the war to recover Pisa. Remember, Piero de' Medici had given away Pisa to the French king on his way down. Of course, the Pisans just laughed at somebody who suggested that they now belonged to France and went on their independent way. And as soon as France was out of the picture, the Pisans were independent, and Florence now had to fight to get back. This exercise was a great mess. It went on and on. The walls of Pisa had been broken, but the French and Swiss soldiers, hired by Florence to do the job, because Florence didn't have a standing army, entered the city. No, they didn't enter the city because they hadn't been paid. They broke down the walls and then they stood and looked and said, we're not going into the city until we get paid. And Florence didn't have the money to pay them, so they then kidnapped the Florentine commissioner anyway. Then Florence asked the King of France to help, and the King of France said, well, you haven't got any money to pay my army either. So they had to sit around and wait till they had some money, or they could borrow some money, and recommence the difficult task of regaining Pisa. It was only in 1509, in fact, that Pisa surrendered. And it involved a power balance and negotiations between the emperor and the King of France, traditional enemies, as well as, of course, the Pope and the Spaniards, and they were all involved in regaining silly little Pisa. The Republican government lasted another 3 years until in 1512, with the agreement, the alliance with the emperor, a Spanish army invaded the area. This Spanish army, Spain, remember, was part of the emperor's domains. The Spanish army caused such atrocious havoc in Prato and Campo Bisenzio, which are two towns very close to Florence, that the Florentines took fright. They thought they were all going to be massacred, and so they surrendered. They surrendered to the acceptance of the return of the Medici. Which Medicis were they to return? They entered the city of Florence in triumph. Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici and Giuliano. Giovanni and Giuliano, the two sons of Lorenzo il Magnifico, who had in effect been in exile in Venice most of that time. Giuliano assumed the reins of power in Florence, and 6 months later, his brother Giovanni was elected Pope. This was Pope Julius, wonderful portrait by Raphael, near the end of Pope Julius's life. Pope Julius, remember, the great military pope and the great, what can we say, provoker of Michelangelo. He and Michelangelo were always at loggerheads about everything, but he was responsible for the painting of the Sistine Chapel, the commission to Michelangelo, and he was responsible for the return of the Medicis in agreement with the emperor at that stage in 1512. Giovanni, very soon after that, 2 years later, becomes Pope. And so he leaves the running of Florence to his brother Giuliano. And in effect, the election of Giovanni as Pope results in the shift of both Medici power and patronage from Florence to Rome. In 1515, Giuliano is made Duke of Nemours by the French king, the man who is memorialized in this wonderful statue. This is a Raphael painting of him. So the brother of Giovanni, of the Pope. He's now put in charge of Florence, but within a year he dies. We should look for a moment here again, where we are exactly. We're here. Giuliano, the third son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, okay? We had Pietro, or Piero, called the Unfortunate. Yes, he's the guy who drowned after making bad ideas with French king. Giovanni, who has been in exile with his brother Giuliano. They return, and almost as soon as he's returned, Pope Julius dies, Giovanni becomes Pope, and Giuliano is left in charge of the city. But as you can see, he dies in 16, less than 3 years after he's taken over power again. So can achieve very little. We're now going to go to this neck of the woods to see what happens with the game of power in Florence. He's succeeded by his nephew Lorenzo, whom his uncle the Pope has now made the Duke of Urbino. So, the son of the unfortunate. Okay, here he is. And he's not going to last very long either. Do you see that he died in 16? He died in 19. So we're having a very interrupted change of power, so to speak, and not much is achieved in re-establishing political stability in Florence under the Medici. So, taking control in Florence after these last two short-lived and almost insignificant Medici is Cardinal Giulio. Now, Giulio is the nephew. So we go back, in a sense, a generation. Giulio is the nephew of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the son of, the illegitimate son, of the brother who was murdered in the cathedral, in the Duomo. So he takes over because we've run out, really here, we've run out of Medici to take over. He takes over the reins of control, and his first great act of patronage is for the now famous tombs of those two, there he is, Giulio, and he gets down immediately to doing works in Florence. He was a very energetic guy with a lot of sneaky ideas as well as actually getting work done. So this is the first commission that he supervises in Florence, the tombs of those two fellows who, in a sense, were just passers-by, and they get these magnificent tombs from Michelangelo. You've all been there in the new sacristy, Michelangelo's little playroom. They are, however, extraordinary pieces of art. In here, they're important as well because of Michelangelo's, I've just called it his playroom. Michelangelo was of the idea that architecture is simply another form of sculpture. And he was the first to take architectural elements and use them in a kind of sculptural way. These things, for example, which he uses in a purely decorative way, and he uses them hugely in the Laurentian Library, would have been corbels as an element in architecture. Corbels, the thing that holds up the eaves of your roof, the bit that sticks out of the wall and holds up. And he's taken them out as an element in its own right, as a decorative element, and he's turned it down like that and stuck it on the wall. It was quite bizarre in its time for this kind of thing, which is like the seat of a Greek pilastra, to put it right up there at the top. And of course to combine the shapes of arches, which are only arches, not hemispheres, together with empty niches. He did all sorts of marvelous things, interestingly enough, but playing with architecture as though it was sculpture, and vice versa, in fact, taking architectural elements and putting them into sculpture. So for these two magnificent pieces of architecture, sculpture, we have Giulio, the nephew of Lorenzo, to thank. And ironically, of course, they're dedicated to the most insignificant and short-lived of the dynasty. But they're part of a period in which the Pope, Leo in Rome, and his cardinal cousin were very much interested and concerned with maintaining the Medici appearance of benevolent enrichment of the city. Their other great project was San Lorenzo, of course. San Lorenzo and its complex was the prime project, interrupted, however, by the course of events precipitated by the death of Pope Leo in December 1522, and the election within a year of his cousin, Cardinal Giulio, to the papal seat as Pope Clement VII. The San Lorenzo Library project and the facade for the Basilica of San Lorenzo, both entrusted to Michelangelo by Clement VII, now had to be put on hold because there was nobody really in Florence who could follow it, and because Clement also wanted the wall of the Sistine Chapel painted by Michelangelo was the Last Judgment. The election of this new pope left Florence without any strong Medici candidate, and it continued the dissipation of Medici power and patronage in Florence. The Medici power and patronage, both spiritually and materially, under the two Medici popes from 1513 to 1534, now fell to Rome. So it coincided, well, it didn't coincide, it almost caused an exodus of the famous artists and the best artisans, workers in all fields of the arts and architecture, to go to Rome, where the city was being, in effect, rebuilt. Back in Florence, the Pope was looked upon as the de facto Signore of the city, although it was governed by the Pope's appointment of Cardinal Silvio Passerini. But Passerini was given the job of governing in the name of two younger Florentine Medicis, Hippolyte on the left and Alexander on the right. Both illegitimate sons of those guys who were buried in the Michelangelo tombs. So that's where we've arrived. And we'll see a comment later about it. Pope Clement himself was beset by political problems, Henry VIII and his divorce issue being one of them, and the Protestant Reformation being a major one. In his political chess game, he changes sides, breaking the Holy League and aligning himself with France, which was very unkind of him, considering they owed the emperor their return to power, the Medicis. The emperor had put them back in power, and he now breaks with the emperor and sides with France. Well, the result was that the emperor sent an army and sacked Rome. Well, you didn't expect that, did you? No. So it gave the Pope a very great fright. And in Florence, the fright of the Pope, the Medici Pope, who was, as I said, de facto ruler of Florence, what happens when the Medici gets a fright like that and is subdued? The Florentines, of course, rebelled and established a republic again. So, kicked out the Medicis for the third or fourth time. Took the opportune moment to drive them out, these two fellows, Ippoliti and Alessandro, driven out and restored the Republic of the Savonarola era. They muddled along for 2 years until Clement changes his mind and makes friends again with the emperor. Making friends with the emperor had the following consequences. The result of this is that the imperial troops besiege Florence, which eventually capitulates after about 14,000 people are killed. The Emperor Charles V is crowned by the Pope in Bologna, I believe the last Holy Roman Emperor to have been crowned by a Pope. And the Emperor names Alessandro, the young man we've just seen, hereditary Signore of Florence, arranging a marriage. There's always one of those attached to these clauses. A marriage between Alessandro and the emperor's daughter, Margherita. Remember where we are. We're at the siege of Florence, because I want to make two slight anecdotal diversions. Firstly, about point 4. Although it sounds irrelevant, it does in effect show a kind of example of the historiography of the Medici, which I'll come to later. I'll mention it again on Friday. But of course, the way the history of the Medici has been explained and recorded has changed a lot at different times. And very many authors have had strong feelings about the Medici. Either they've hated them, and you can tell by the way they write, or they've thought they are beyond any defect, and they've written in such a eulogistic way. However, this is the little story. A curious writer and minor politician. In fact, he was the mayor of Florence at the time of the Great Flood in 1966, a man called Pietro Bargellini, quite a character. I think on that occasion he was the right man in the right place, because he did marvelous work and he did marvelous efforts to uplift the population, who of course were absolutely devastated by this extraordinary flood in 1966, which we've all just relived because it was 50 years ago. Florence in the last 3 months has been memories of the flood, exhibitions in every space. However, Piero Bargellini wrote a history of the Medici, and he was following an even more eccentric 19th century Italian historian who had lived in Paris. When he wrote about the Medici Pope brokering this marriage between Alessandro and the emperor's natural daughter, he wrote this: La stalla dei mulli Medici si nobilitava, ma non mutava carattere, etc. Which translated is this: the stable of the Medici mules has ennobled itself, but hasn't changed its character. Bastard Pope Clement VII, bastard Alexandra, bastard the blonde Marguerite, and the deal is done. Of course, it's perfectly true, they were all bastards. But I must say that bastard she may have been and blonde, but she went on to become the Duchess of Parma and later the regent of the Spanish Netherlands. So she was no she was no dumb cookie, let's face it. There's a very funny other quotation about her. Somebody wrote, in Rome, she conducted a nocturnal life, certainly not worthy of the niece of a pope. Oh yes, and the popes were so meh. The second small diversion is that the siege, here shown by Vasari, it's such a lovely picture, this, isn't it? We're on the south of the city, looking north. These walls were built mostly by Michelangelo. Here's the fortezza that you see. No, not the Fortezza di Basso, which is over there, but the Forte Belvedere, and the monastery church here, probably of San Miniato, although this might be San Miniato. Anyway, I live on this hill, and it's here, in this area called Gavinana, where the last battle of this siege took place. The little diversion I want to make is that the siege is remembered in Florence today by a football match. At least I use the word football as a default term for this game, which in Italian is the calcio storico, and which is said to have been organized in this year, 1530, to cock a snook at the besiegers, at the French and imperial armies that were besieging the city. It was organizzato con strepito di fanfare, in spregio, cocking a snook at the assedianti, the people who were besieging the city, so that the armies around could hear how much the Florentines were enjoying themselves in spite of being besieged. It continues today. Michelangelo, who had some part in the defense, building the defense constructions of the city, is also credited with the costumes of this historic football come rugby come massacre match, for which this is the prize. So Alessandro, Duke of Florence, is now installed to renew the Medici authority in Florence. And he's given that title, Duke of Florence, by his uncle, who is the Pope, of course. His governorship was not remarkable as a period of Medici power or patronage. Florence was an occupied city, and imperial troops would remain there for another 20 years. The two monuments which remain from Alessandro's period are the gigantic fort built for him by Giuliano di San Gallo, and that's the Fortezza di Basso, and Baccio Bandinelli's marble sculpture of Hercules and Cacus. I don't really consider building a massive fort as an act of patronage, no matter how much of an artist is the architect. But it remains, that's the plan of it, which you can't see so well in the photograph because of the rest of the city around it. But it remains the biggest monument ever built by the Medici in Florence, and it remains a very much used one. Exhibitions and trade fairs are held here constantly. The Bandinelli sculpture, on the other hand, is far more interesting. It's often cited as another allegorical statement referring to the Medici overcoming, let us say, negative forces, usually the forces of republicanism, overcoming those forces by the Medici wit and strengths. The story is quite the contrary, in fact, because the commission for the sculpture was from the civic authorities negotiated with Michelangelo in 1505, a Republican government, during a Republican period, just as with the Michelangelo's David. But Michelangelo was once again too busy, and then he returned to Rome. And in 1525, 20 years later, they were still talking about it, and it was another Republican period, the second Republican period, and Bandinelli was approached. Bandinelli also seemed to procrastinate, and then again in 1528, Michelangelo was consulted. Finally, Pope Clement and Alessandro asked Bandinelli to finish the job, and that's when it was produced in 1530 as a Medician statue. But, as I say, it had already been ordered 25 years earlier by the Republican government. It seems almost as though Bandinelli was reluctant. He was trying to avoid working for the Republican government. And that might have been just as well, because when Cosimo I became Duke, he wasn't keen on anybody who had had close dealings with the Republicans. But there you are, you have in front of the seat of government two allegorical figures which serve whichever side is in power. So they serve as visions of the Republican liberty, and they serve as visions of Medician suppression of bad things and bad guys. In January 1537, Duke Alexander was assassinated. And I wanted to show you a clip from a 1935 film about him and about the assassination, which is a great story in history of Italy. But the technology won't allow me to show you that clip. It's something that's depicted in much later, actually, in 19th century art. There's very little art at the time of his assassination. He was assassinated by Lorenzini, who was a cousin, and according to one writer, also his lover. Alessandro was a much depraved character, it would seem. And Lorenzini murdered him, he said, for the good of Florence, but he rushed off, Lorenzini rushed off into exile, first to Rome, then to Venice. And in Venice, I think about 8 years later, he was assassinated because Cosimo I, Grand Duke, had put a taglia on his head, had put a reward out. So that was the end of Alessandro, who, remember, was almost the last on this side of our family tree. It's good always to look here, what's going on. There he was, there he is, and that's the end of the principal branch coming from Cosimo. So where do they look to re-establish the Medicis? They have to go onto this, the cadet branch, so to speak. And the guy that they choose is here, Cosimo I, he's going to become. He's the son of the most military of all Medici characters, Giovanni della Banda Nera, who was a great mercenary soldier. This is the young man, 19 years old, who looks so upright, intelligent, confident, and elegant. And he ushers in a new age for Florence, a new order, a new aesthetic, a new power. we can see both the diplomatic and the powerful impression of being suited in armor like this. He was, to prove himself, an extraordinary man. This may be the first of the grand ducal portraits by the painter Bronzino. I don't know if anyone's counted how many portraits Bronzino did, but they seem to be endless, including all of Cosimo's family. That's not all of Cosimo's family. Cosimo had 11 children, but that's most of them, including, of course, this very famous portrait of Eleonora of Toledo, whom Cosimo very wisely married. She brought with her a great dowry, which was well used. She was another of the very intelligent and entrepreneurial Medici women that I mentioned the other day. She died, unfortunately, very young, together with that young son who's in the picture, and this son here, who was a teenager at the time. She was, I think, about 41 or 42. And they seem to have been a great partnership, these two. And he was never quite the same after her death, although he later, when he kind of retired, he did marry another young woman. Anyway, the portraits of Bronzino go on and on, because Bronzino was in his 30s at the beginning of Cosimo's reign, and he became court artist, and he remained so for nearly half a century, undertaking, as I said, portrait after portrait after portrait. Under the patronage of Cosimo and Cosimo's successor Francesco, he's left a really extraordinary album of family portraits of the Medici, both contemporary to him and those of previous generations. Even when he painted a religious painting, it seems, he couldn't resist, or perhaps it was the Duke's idea, to include the family, so to speak. Bronzino held Raphael and Michelangelo in great awe, and we can see the admiration in this lovely painting of Bronzino of the Holy Family, comparing Michelangelo's famous Donna Tondi. He couldn't, of course, remarkable familiarity in Joseph. One doesn't know whether it was the Duke imposing himself, or whether it was Bronzino in awe of the Duke that he appears in all sorts of places. But in Florence is now living under a new order. The Medici dukes will continue the family's tradition of patronage in areas and activities different from their Renaissance ancestors. I quote, "Tuscan art in the Renaissance had been the art of the city, because in a sense the entire city had participated in it. When it became a courtly pursuit, limited to the pleasure of prince and courtier, the Tuscan genius lost contact with its roots and people and ceased to be an object of popular delight. This contact was never re-established." This is the difference between 15th century and 16th century Florence, between Renaissance and what one might call Enlightenment. The 15th century Medici had been interested primarily and huge patrons of art of all kinds, music, books, philosophy, the visual arts. The next generations of Medici are going to be more interested in engineering, science, instruments, astronomy, and so on and so forth. Not losing, however, the pride of being great patrons of these subjects. We shall see the change in the new subject matter of visual arts as well. Portraits, allegory, and apotheoses become more important. One only has to look, I think, at the difference between these two men, the Cosimo of the first of the foundation family and the Cosimo of the successive generations, to see a difference in the Weltanschauung of the whole Medici change that has taken place. The intimate sculpture, for example, of the 15th century, the Medici Davids, the Verrocchio David, the David of Donatello, that kind of thing, has now been changed to monumental, the David and the Perseus. Quite different scale, a quite different feeling behind the creation of such things. It is said that Cosimo I commissioned work with specific political connections to the other sculptural works on this piazza, that he wanted to create a whole piazza where the power and the importance of the Medici dynasty was clear. Giambologna and Bandinelli, the two great court artists of the time, produced such monumental and allegorical things. This is Florence overcoming Pisa. I've seen it in the Bargello, and it's heavy. This is the kind of Roman-inspired hero monument of Cosimo's father, Giovanni delle Bande Nere. Cosimo was very clever, he was hard-working and determined. The first years of his governance were difficult, and he had major political and diplomatic successes in dealing with the Emperor Charles V and his successor, Philip. By the early 1550s, he was recognized as a major power in the widest European canvas, and he had received that Order of the Golden Fleece, as I mentioned, which he didn't fail to show everybody. He finished the Laurentian Library, and in each of those windows he managed to have his Golden Fleece shown. Giorgio Vasari was perhaps the greatest of the Grand Ducal employees, shall we say. Like the sculptor Giambologna and the painter Bronzino, artist and architect Vasari was practically a permanent employee of the Grand Duke, for whom he painted a huge number of frescoes, but extraordinarily important, he created and built the Uffizi, which contained just one room, the tribuna, of the Medici precious paintings and sculpture, antique sculpture. The rest of the Uffizi, as the name implies, was built to house the administrative offices of the government, of the Duke, and probably also, we're not sure, the offices of the Medici Bank. Vasari was further entrusted with the project to paint the internal surface of the dome of the cathedral. Perhaps just a little bit jealous of the Sistine and Michelangelo, the Grand Duke decided that it should be painted with the Last Judgment. It was a labor which would not be finished before the deaths of both Vasari and the Grand Duke. They died within 2 years of each other. And although it commenced in 1568, it took 11 years to paint. 3,600 square meters had to be painted. And it's taken